Welcome back to uncovering the aesthetics of the natural and human environments. On today's podcast, we're going to dive into looking at the natural aesthetics of the mountains in Banff by using Carlson Provost's environmental model, and then I'm going to dive in to look at the human-built environment, aka an urban site, by uncovering the aesthetic qualities of the Toronto Premium Outlets by Carlson's ecological approach, with some critiques to make it more aesthetic in my eyes. Finally, this episode will wrap up with the big question. Should there be a single environmental aesthetic approach or different distinct approaches to appreciate the natural and urban environments? Sit back and relax because this podcast is about to begin. The natural environment I'll be looking at is the mountains I visited while hiking around Banff. To start, Carlson's environmental model highlights that we're all within the natural environment, and to guide our appreciation, there must be some kind of structure to this guide. Thus, he concluded that we must have common sense, a type of scientific knowledge that allows us to have a greater appreciation for the nature around us. So using this model and concept, let's look at the aesthetic highlights of the mountains. The first thing I noticed while being here is the mountains, of course, and how I'm existing in nature through all of my senses. When looking at the mountains, we can visually see that they're vast, the snowy peaks, how the vegetation stops growing at the same point, the rich gray color, the magnitude of them. We notice the surface level features and therefore the surface level aesthetic qualities of them. However, with a little bit of scientific knowledge, we can obtain a subsurface aesthetic understanding that Carlson elicited we needed. So let's dive in. Personally, I love rocks and everything to geology, so obtaining a greater aesthetic appreciation of the natural environment was not hard for me, and with the knowledge I'll provide to you, you'll obtain a greater guide to the aesthetic appreciation of these mountains. Aesthetic guide number 1. The aesthetics of the vastness and magnitude which appealed to my sense of sight and through my knowledge enhance that view. My knowledge, and now your knowledge, allow me to understand that these mountains are so big due to the millions of years that the tectonic plates beneath are subducting, which cause the mountains to be so large in magnitude. Aesthetic guide number 2, the rich gray color. Aesthetically appealing to my sight and touch while being enhanced through my knowledge. The color gray is due to the type of rock the Rocky Mountains are made out of, granite. Which raw, meaning not the finished product you see in granite countertops, is a rich gray color due to being a coarse-grained intrusive igneous rock. Intrusive igneous rock means that it forms within the earth at high temperatures for many years. Now you can grasp a deeper aesthetic appreciation for the color since you know the knowledge behind it. Aesthetic guide number 3, the snowy peaks and halting of the vegetation, which is due to the altitude change. This appealed to my sense of smell and sight. The peaks of the mountain experience colder and drier air, meaning the moisture that was in the clouds precipitated out as snow. And then as you move down the mountain, it gets warmer due to the lower altitude, causing the snow to melt. Thus, that distinct line that we see forms. And as the vegetation of these mountains have not evolved and adapted to those conditions, that's why we see them stop at the same level across all the mountains. As you can tell, me seeing these aesthetic highlights of the mountains was overwhelming, and as Carlson said, an unguided, large buzzing confusion. However, overwhelming sense was scaled back due to the limited geological knowledge I have, which overall caused my guide to aesthetic appreciation of the mountains to be scaled back to only the subsurface features. And now with the little biological knowledge and geological knowledge I provided to you, your aesthetic appreciation has increased, causing you to see the rich aesthetic highlights. Now that I showed you how I guide myself and you through the aesthetic appreciation of nature, let's look at a way to guide you through the human urban aesthetics. To guide you, I'll be referring to Carlson Provost's model of the ecological approach to human environments. To start, let's talk about this approach. Carlson implies that we can view human environments as consisting as interlocking quote-unquote ecosystems, with the notion of functional fit as a key to appreciate the urban creation, development, and continual survival as looking as they should. Guide 1. What do you picture when referring to a mall? Well, for me, when looking at the Toronto outlets, I see people walking around and or consuming the goods in the stores, and there's LED signs everywhere that highlight the storefronts. To me, these are the main aesthetic highlights of this mall. Guide 2, incorporating functional fit. The aspects mentioned before are interrelated to each other. They have a certain type of functional fit. We appreciate the LED lights are powered by hidden electrical wiring that allow for all people walking the mall to know what store is where, allowing them to consume goods. We appreciate that when people are consuming the goods, it allows for money to enter the system for the continual development of the mall. The functional fit and interdependence of these aspects allow for the whole shopping mall to be seen in unity. Each variable is adding to the ecosystem of the mall. Aesthetic guide number 3, unity of functional fit. This unity of all aspects allows us to aesthetically appreciate the whole mall, from the people to the LEDs to the storefronts, as one object because it's developed to look as it should, not as a bunch of objects or people within an area with no functionalism. If we were to see these aspects dependently from one another, it would be hard to see the aesthetic appreciation because in isolation, these things may not look as it should. For example, just the LED signs and their wiring. This serves no purpose, but when placed outside a storefront with people walking, it has a purpose. Its functionality is seen. Without each aspect being related to each other, the mall quote-unquote ecosystem would not survive, and the individual aspects would not survive because they have no purpose, thus no aesthetic qualities. But when the mall is seen as a whole, people, lights, stores, the aspects thrive together, causing the overall mall to show its true aesthetic qualities. This guide to the highlights of the mall aesthetics truly solidifies that we must see the distinct aesthetic qualities as being interrelated to obtain a true heightened aesthetic appreciation. Now, how do we increase the aesthetic qualities of the Toronto Premium Outlet Mall? There are two major aspects I noticed throughout the Toronto outlets that take away from the aesthetic qualities of it: the name and the random aspects placed throughout it. So let's fix these to get a better appreciation. The first aspect Carlson mentioned that I agree with is changing the name so the functionality of the center is at the forefront of our minds and becomes part of our aesthetic appreciation. Let's call the Toronto Premium Outlet Mall the Designer Object Shopping Mall. This functional description allows us to more easily appreciate the mall because we know the functionality of it, how it has those designer objects, designer clothes, which helps us reinforce our aesthetic appreciation of it. The second aspect that Carlson mentions is that everything develops and changes over time to look how it should, which once again, I agree with. The Toronto outlets have an aspect like a playground and random vendors throughout the mall, which to me doesn't have aesthetic interest or merit since it doesn't fit in with the developing designer object and designer clothes environment. So, the removal of these would allow for greater aesthetic appreciation since the mall will look correctly developed, which allows us to appreciate the designer aesthetic highlights more readily. Finally, let's talk if there should be one environmental aesthetic or distinct environmental aesthetics for both natural and urban environments. Personally, I think there should be two distinct aesthetics for natural and urban environments. The natural environment possesses a different aesthetic than the urban environment and vice versa. In the natural environment, there are different types of elements that are appreciated differently, from the biodiversity, knowledge of the environment, and the quote-unquote scenic view. Whereas the urban environment, we appreciate the cultural buildings and the human-made infrastructure. So let's apply Kant's concept of the sublime. You can apply the dynamical and mathematical sublime to a natural landscape as the power and strength of a natural disaster strikes pain, pleasure, or fear into us, humbling a human in the face of nature, but only when we view it from a safe place. But to me, there is no human-made urban environment that has been made so dynamically, mathematically sublime that it elicits the same sense of fear, pain, or pleasure. So how can we apply Kant's sublimity of environmental aesthetics to urban environment? Next, the sensory aspect of urban and natural environments. The natural environment appeals to our senses differently than the urban environment does. The natural environment provides us with a fresh smell, vibrant colors, natural sounds, like we are one with the environment. Whereas the urban environment, our senses are stimulated by the architectural designs and the busyness of the streets. What if we were to apply Macaulay's view of the apolitical walker through an urban environment to natural environments? You cannot tune out the surroundings when in nature, as hearing, seeing, and being immersed within the aspects of that said nature provides a more intense aesthetic to that environment. Whereas in an urban environment, you do not need to hear the busyness of the streets to appreciate that infrastructure around you. You only need your sight to see the aesthetic qualities. So a distinct aesthetic for urban and natural environments will take into account for the different sensory experiences which enhance our aesthetic appreciation of that environment. Finally, the knowledge needed to aesthetically appreciate urban and natural environments. Natural environments, like intrinsic biodiversity, are more highly appreciated through scientific knowledge because you understand the processes and history of that landscape, like Carlson mentioned. However, urban places are more appreciated by having an uncorrupted political, societal, or cultural views. How would one political knowledge help them attain a greater aesthetic for a mountain? How would one scientific knowledge help them obtain a greater aesthetic for a shopping mall? Since urban and natural environments produce their own aesthetics that are distinct from each other in many different ways, there is a heightened need for distinct aesthetics to appreciate both the urban and natural environment. Thank you for listening to this podcast about the aesthetic guide for the natural environment through Carlson's environmental model, urban environment through Carlson's ecological approach, and reasons why there should be two distinct aesthetics for those said environments by looking at different methods and models of aesthetic appreciation. Tune in next time for a new podcast. Stay safe, have a great day.